Everyone, my name is Lauren Mercier, and today we're going to be talking about invasive species in the Capital Region, what they do to our daily lives, and the role of the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management in all of this. So to start off, we are the Capital Region Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. We cover 11 counties in the area. It is a state-funded program. We work closely with the DEC and other state agencies to do invasive species management. So there are 7 PRISMs throughout the state. We are the Capital Region one, but there are others depending on different regions. So there's Finger Lakes, Western New York, Adirondacks, St. Lawrence, Catskills, Lower Hudson, and Long Island. So we all have the same basic mission statement, which is to detect, prevent, and control invasive species through direct action and education in order to protect biodiversity, the natural environment, the economy, and our quality of life. So the PRISM has a couple different roles that we play in the community. We coordinate partner efforts. We recruit and train volunteers. We deliver education and outreach. We conduct early detection and establish monitoring networks. We implement eradication and control efforts, and we can also award funding for invasive species related work through our RFP process, which is request for proposal. So these are just a couple of things that we do in the community in order to raise awareness on invasive species and control them in areas that they have already arrived. So you might be wondering, what even is an invasive species? An invasive species is any non-native species that can cause harm to the environment, the economy, or human health. They can be from all around the world, even within our own country. So I have a couple definitions just to clear some things up. A native species is a species that is indigenous to a region, and this is before European settlement. So an example of this is common milkweed. It was here before the settlers arrived, and it supports a lot of biodiversity and is really important to the ecosystems that it lives in. So we want to keep it there. A non-native species is an accidental or purposeful introduction of a species. So a lot of our food crops are actually non-native species, but they're contained in such a way that they don't cause any problems, and they actually do us more good than harm. A nuisance species is a species that interferes with human activities. So a nuisance species could be native or non-native. An example of this is a dandelion. So they commonly are grown in our yards, and we don't really want them there, but that doesn't mean that they're not native. So a lot of them live in the natural environment and are supposed to be there, yet we don't want them in our yards. So we try to get rid of them just for aesthetic purposes, but there's no need to get rid of them because they aren't causing any harm to the environment. Where an invasive species, on the other hand, is something that we really don't want in an area because they are non-native, they reproduce really quickly, and they can push out the good native species that we want. So there's a few threats that invasive species cause to our daily lives, or can have on our daily lives. First is that they decrease biodiversity, which is really important for maintaining a healthy ecosystem and healthy selves. So we rely on a lot of different plants and animals for survival. Different ways. We use trees for houses. We eat plants for food. We have pets, lots of different things. So we use the natural environment in a lot of different ways And when these invasive species come, they decrease the number of species that are in an area, particularly native species, and really cause harm to us and the environment. They also degrade habitat, decrease recreational opportunities. As you can see in the photo, that is hydrilla on a boat motor. So if your boat gets stuck in that, it's really hard to get out of, and it's not really nice to go swimming in. So we don't want that happening in our water bodies. Invasive species can also damage crops and can spread diseases to humans and livestock. Invasive species in the US cost an estimated $120 billion annually, which is a lot of money. So that is through prevention costs, control costs, inspections, all these different things add up really quickly. So we do our best to try to prevent them from coming in so they don't rack up these large bills when we try to control them. So an example is in this photo. This is the spotted lanternfly as a juvenile. So this bug has taken over Pennsylvania and is on the border of New York and Pennsylvania, so we're doing our best to keep it out. It affects 70 different types of plants, including grapes, hops, apples, and maple trees, which are all really important for our economy and will cost millions of dollars if it comes in and infects these areas. So that's just one species alone that can cause millions of dollars in damage. And when you add that to all the hundreds of other species that are invasive and causing problems, those numbers add up really quickly and can create lots of problems for our economy. Oops. So some invasive species share a couple common characteristics. First is a lot of them don't have any known predators or healthy competition, which allows them to take over in areas. They generally have a competitive advantage over native and local species. They respond better to changes in temperatures and harsh environments. Most of them are generalist species, so they don't really have a preference. Some of them are low in nutritional value for anything that would eat it. Some are capable of greater population growth and dispersal. So, for example, purple loosestrife, one plant produces thousands of seeds, whereas some native flowers only produce a couple hundred. They can also populate disturbed soils really quickly, and they can keep native plants from returning to an area by changing the soil composition. They also have the ability to form monocultures, which are dense single-species stands that limit the availability of water, light, nutrients, and space for other plants. So in this photo, this is Japanese stiltgrass. This is in a forest habitat. So in the understory of a forest, you would expect to see leaf litter and other understory plants, lots of wildlife, things like that. But when this species comes into an area, it completely takes over and it looks like a meadow rather than the understory of a forest, which completely changes the entire ecosystem and affects the ecosystem services that the forest might provide for us. So there's a couple different ways that we categorize invasive species. First is the invasion curve. So this is a time and area scale. So as the amount of time increases for a species being in an area, the area infested is anticipated to increase, which makes control costs go rapidly high. So we try to focus a lot of our efforts in the tier 1 and tier 2 species so that we don't have the extreme costs of managing the tier 3 and tier 4 species. So tier 1 is prevention. That means it's not in the area yet, and we're doing everything in our power to keep it out. This is the most cost-efficient way of doing invasive species management because we aren't going back and trying to redo or remake an environment that has been damaged. We are protecting the environment from becoming damaged at all. Tier 2 is eradication. So this means that there's a small localized population of the invasive species, and we can spend money to try to get rid of that population and prevent it from spreading into other areas. So we do a lot of tier 2 eradications and control efforts so that they don't become widespread and cost us more money to take care of. Tier 3 is containment. So the spread becomes more widespread and is very quick and makes eradication very unlikely, but we still try to focus some of our efforts depending on the quality of the environment. So if it's a high quality priority conservation area and there's a large population of an invasive, we'll try to remove it to restore that ecosystem and prevent it from moving even further than it already has. And then tier 4 is long-term management. So this is of species that have become so widespread that eradication is impossible. Unfortunately, this is where a lot of people first realize that we even have invasive species is when it's too late. So we try to do a lot of education and outreach for the emerging species so that they don't become so problematic as the tier 4 species. New York State also has its own ranking system. So they score an individual plant based on 4 different categories. Its ecological impact, its biological characteristics, its distribution, and its difficulty to control. So they're scored out of 100 and then placed into different categories of threat, which is pictured here. So any plant that scores higher than 80 is a very high threat, and the threats decrease as you go down by 10 and 20 at the bottom. But so we use this to determine whether or not a project is more high priority than another. And then we also use those scores to determine whether or not a plant will be placed on our prohibited or regulated list. So these are part of the legislation, Part 575, which created a prohibited and regulated list of different plant and animal invasive species. And the difference between prohibited and regulated is that prohibited cannot be knowingly possessed with the intent to sell, import, purchase, transport, or introduce the species. In addition, the person cannot propagate any prohibited invasive species. Whereas a regulated species, you might have it in your gardens, but you can't go and transport that to a free living state. This is similar to what happens with an aquarium. So you can go buy a fish at the pet store. It's not illegal for you to buy the fish. But when you release it into a water body, then that species is on the regulated list. You can get fined. So prohibited is more strict, whereas regulated, you can still have it, but we encourage people not to release the plants or the animals into the natural environment. So here's a couple examples of the differences between the tiers and the scores and how we prioritize management. So Oriental Bittersweet is a tier 4 species, which means it's very widespread, and it has a very high threat score of 87. So if this species is in a priority conservation area, we will do our best to remove as much of it as possible because it has such a high threat to the environment and the economy. Periwinkle, on the other hand, is a tier 2 and has a fairly moderate score. So we wouldn't be as focused on that because it has such a moderate score. However, since it is tier 2, we are more likely to be able to eradicate it. So depending on how much money there is, you could do both. If it were between periwinkle and kudzu, on the other hand, both are tier 2. Kudzu has a much higher score, which means it's a greater threat. So we would definitely target the kudzu before we target the periwinkle, because kudzu has more of an impact on our environment than the periwinkle does. So now that you have a basic overview of what invasive species are and the problems that they cause, here's a couple ways that you can help prevent the spread. So first is Clean, Drain, Dry. This is a campaign for aquatic recreation. So when you go out into a water body, make sure that your boat is cleaned off, you're draining the water, drying off your boat before you enter a new water body. Same goes for all your fishing gear, your kayaks, paddle boards, all different water recreation items. Similarly, Play Clean Go is more of a terrestrial campaign. So we encourage people when they go hiking, clean off their boots using a boot brush, clean off their tires on their bikes, make sure your dog doesn't have any seeds on them, things like that, just to prevent the spread of invasive species. We also encourage people to plant native plants in their gardens and to report any sightings of invasive species into IMAP Invasives. So our website has a lot of information on identification of invasive species that you might be able to find in your yards or in your local water body. So we encourage people to keep an eye out for them, and if they do see them, there's a cool app called IMAP Invasives, which you can download on your smartphone or use online. It'll take GPS coordinates of your location, and you put in the species name, and it'll create a pinpoint in a map, which can be accessed by anyone. And you can see where a species is and its geographic spread, which is really helpful for management. We also encourage people to not move firewood. So if you're buying firewood, do not move it more than 50-mile radius from where you bought it from or where you cut it from, because this can spread forest pests. Finally, we encourage people to properly dispose of invasive plant material that they may have removed from their yards. So we have another webinar on our website called Disposal and Composting of Invasive Species. So this has more in-depth information on how to properly dispose of invasive plants, which is really important to consider when you are managing in your own yards. So I hope this is a helpful video and you've learned a little bit today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Lauren. I've provided my email here and our website, so you can go check it out. We will be posting more webinars on our website, so be more information for you to absorb. And we also have fact sheets, and we have links to other resources for you to check out for more information. So thank you.